Welcome aboard as we talk our big stories. And this morning, our main issue has to do with the single spine salary structure. Now, organized labor and government have agreed that there is an urgent need to review the single spine pay policy to ensure fair remuneration for workers. Now, the pay policy was introduced over a decade ago in 2010 to address pay gaps and worsening conditions of service of employees. But the labor unions say their service conditions are rather worsening. How so? Minister for Employment and Labor Relations Ignatius Bafwewa says the review is expected to be completed by March and a roadmap for implementation adopted. Let's find out what he had to say on this matter.
On our second thematic area, i.e. salaries, conditions of service and productivities, these were the outcomes. Government should review the single spine pay policy to address the current issues of salary inequities, inequalities, weak salary administration, and weak management of conditions of service. In this regard, government should constitute a technical committee by end of March 2022 to undertake a preliminary review of the single spine pay policy, including cost implications, and advise government on addressing these issues. The review should be aligned to the next budget cycle. Thereafter, government should develop a roadmap of the implementation of the revised pay policy. To ensure sustainability in compensation payments, the social partners must work together to agree on a medium-term framework for adjustment of public sector pay and to work collectively to improve revenue mobilization. 12. Government should resource the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission to build its capacity to perform its functions for pay administration in the public service more efficiently and effectively. The social partners should work with government to review the legislative framework for pay administration in the public sector to support the reforms towards addressing issues including salaries inequities and irregularities, weak link between pay to productivity, and sustainability of the payroll.
And we know part of this has been triggered by the National Labour Conference, the maiden one, and matters emanating from there. Well, joining us for the conversation, we have Senyo Ajabing, a labor consultant and HR specialist. He joins us as we talk about the single spine pay policy and, of course, the single spine salary structure. Mr. Ajabing, a very good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for making the time to be with us this morning. I know you're on a tight leash in terms of your time, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. So how did we get here? And I ask this question from the fact that with such policies, we would have expected to review them probably more often. Right from the outset, we had the situation where there was a bit of joy at the fact that salaries were going to be reviewed. And then we had instances where some salaries were adjusted and some people felt it was comfortable being there. But for some people, there was no material increment as they would have expected it. But we've waited some 12 years, and that is where I would like us to start from. How often should we have been reviewing a policy like this?
Thank you very much. Good morning to your listeners. Generally, such policies would have to go through a comprehensive audit sometime after 5 years to be able to correct all the technical issues. And then by the 10th year, it should have gone through systematic review to a point where it is, achieving most of its objectives. Unfortunately, I've not heard that any such audits have been done by the stakeholders or discussions by the stakeholders. And then beyond the 10th year, we are still yet to do any policy, because 10 years, over 10 years is way overdue to review such policies.
So we've already waited too long, far too long. You're suggesting that in a maximum of 5 years, we ought to have taken a second look at this. We've waited for over a decade, in fact, 12 years. And so we've already waited too long. What would you say moving forward, even before we talk about that now, in terms of a review policy?
Well, I think that the first step has been taken. The National Labour Conference would tease out all the various issues for the commencement of consultative process, which would then take care of, OT will then have to sit down and draft the necessary changes, send it through the tripartite committee, and then beyond that, it goes through the processes of legislation, and then the change can be done. I think that immediately, though, something can also be done. The LI can be reviewed. Fair Wages and Salaries Act of 2007 can be reviewed, and that is normally easier to do. So that would start taking care of the issues before the long approach of, or the long-standing approach of reviewing legislation then comes policy, so that it can be taken care of and immediately the legislation reviewed. Yeah.
So we had this policy to regulate the payment of public service workers, especially those falling under Article 190 of the 1992 Constitution, civil service, audit service, the judicial service, and all of that. And some, I'll have to pose this question. For you, from where you sit, what was the proper understanding you had of what this policy was meant to achieve? And do you feel it has achieved that in any shape or form? To what extent, if you do agree that it has achieved its purpose?
Well, this is an interesting question. I think that the policy came about from the conversation somewhere around 2005. It was then decided that certainly productivity has to be matched with appropriate remuneration. So then it was agreed that the policy would then, a pay policy would then be put in place to kind of take care of the needs of workers as a way. So that generally was the beginning of the conversation that led to this pay policy. But the major thing, I think, from the government side that I remember was that the government payroll was largely scattered. Various public service groupings had various different, sub to them, and so everything was disintegrated, even though the civil service and a large section of the public sector were on the GUSS, Ghana Universal Salary Structure. So it became important of public sector organizations were using their IGF to pay certain large allowances, and also to ensure that there was control over remuneration spending or remuneration expenditure in the public services. So for me, that has been largely achieved. Unfortunately, not up enough to make any difference. And here, I don't think that we can blame the organized labor or labor employees too much, because economic conditions just have not been able to ensure that the policy is funded well. So some of these things were the objects of the pay policy. And for me, in terms of the consolidation, it has been achieved. Unfortunately, the pay expectations of the employee and organized labor has not been achieved. They have been lacking, or enough consultations have been lacking. And then finally, I also think that dispute resolution mechanisms that the Fair Wages and Salaries Act put in place to ensure that disputes when they occur, grievances when they occur, are resolved smoothly. those have not also worked. So these are some of the areas that I believe would be important to employees, and so that we have, a more peaceful environment on the labor front.
And it's important that you mentioned that more peaceful, environment on the labor front, especially as we've seen the sort of agitations we've seen in recent times from different groupings, different unions, the teacher unions and all of that, UTAG prominent. In terms of, the component where people would get proper remuneration, that has been fulfilled. But when it comes to the equivalence, when it comes to performance, that is what we've not been able to manage properly. Is that what you were suggesting before you wrapped up?
Suggesting is that the structure of consolidating government payroll to bring all government workers generally under one payroll, so that issues of relativity, government can know how much, for example, in terms of cost,
right,
that is applicable to the payroll. However, I'm also saying that certainly employees' expectations under the policy have not been met because they still believe that they are not well paid.
right.
Now, that is where the whole problem lies. If the salary administration or the single spine pay policy is, then of course we cannot say that the policy has been very successful. But when it comes to the structure, it has been sorted out, and that's a good thing, to
Right.
consolidate government expenditure under one payroll for its sector workers. That is important. That has been achieved. But still, per the expectations of the employees, it is not. We cannot say that the policy has been successful.
How relevant do you feel this maiden National Labour Conference has been in light of all these matters that we're discussing? How innovative is it that 12 years on, we have this kind of conference with the minister, the sector minister for labour and employment there? How relevant is it?
We've not had enough fora to consult on issues regarding labor. The labor stakeholders have not consulted enough, in my view. And even if they do, most of the level of the tripartite committee, and even the tripartite committee, I don't believe meets very often. There has to be more platforms
Okay.
for stakeholders to constantly engage. And the more they engage, the more grievance. Labor relations is a relationship, and it is not a relationship for services. It's a human relationship. And so where there is lack of communication or a reduced communication, there would be increased problems because the disagreements are going to grow. And I think that is what has happened here. So this forum on the calendar of the Ministry of Labour and Employment Relations, and make sure that it happens. But not only that, more platforms like this have to be created in different forms. The GTUC can put their own platform and have maybe at least 2 fora like this in a year.
Right.
The ministry has theirs. Maybe other CSOs of labor can also create such platforms so that
Right.
we keep in. Indeed, the Salaries Act, where it's also a tripartite platform where they negotiate as well as deliberate on issues concerning the single spine pay policy.
Right.
So it's a good thing in the right direction. We need more of that. And I think that there haven't been enough consultations, and that's why I believe we are having all of
So
this.
following from this, you would want to see, apart from maybe something on a national scale, maybe a regional scale, or more consultation from the sector ministry from time to time. How often would you say that we should be looking at such engagement to ensure that we have something watertight moving forward into the next 5 years?
I think that a minimum of 3 government agency and then also employers association to continue talking and make sure that we're able to overcome all the differences that we're having in the system.
All right. So that would be just about one every quarter, if I get your suggestion.
Basically, that would be enough. Yes.
All right. Now, let's look at the fact that in this year, yes, we've had that, just a few days ago, we had that interaction, and very recently, I should say. And the proposal has been made that a tech of issues. And I know for a fact that they are also going to be reviewing some of the cost implications of a review of the policy. What are the dynamics going to be? I mean, the standard of living or the cost of living has changed. We know about the increments from time to time when it comes to public sector workers versus maybe Article 71 office holders, for example, who are in a different category. But what would you, as this technical committee reviews the single spine pay policy, what are some of the things that you feel cannot be missed that we ought to be focusing on in this review?
Well, you other fora I've mentioned it, but this is a great platform to mention it. Salary increments in Ghana have normally followed the inflationary increments, okay, the inflationary figures. So that normally would mean that the nominal or actual increment of salaries hardly occur. So if inflation is 10% and you increase salaries by 10%, that only means that nominal terms made any substantial value addition to that salary. You just restored it from inflationary losses. So I think that is the structure of negotiating the salary should shift from just inflationary restoration to value addition. That way we would see a more realistic increment that will sustain employees. As it is, when you continue to inflationary increments or you lag behind the inflationary figures, then the value of the supplement within this 12 years to the basic salaries on the single spine pay policy pay structure. And so that would be one of the things to look at, how increments are done and the factors that go into the increment. And for example, they can agree on specific factors that beyond inflation and other economic factors that would inform the increments. Another area I see is that there are a lot of costs to the payroll in kind,
right.
Non-cash allowances or non-cash benefits, on the payroll is huge, and under those circumstances, it becomes difficult to track that. So instead of provide them with certain free services,
right,
or like fuel and so on, you want to pay the money to them, consolidate the allowances and especially the benefits in kind, consolidate them into cash so that it can be seen and can be enhanced. That way, workers will pay more tax and the government would also benefit. For me, these are the two areas I think should be looked at. And if this is done, we will maybe start seeing a more credible and more realistic government payroll, which is acceptable to all the stakeholders.
Let me bring in Dr. Kwabena Nyakun Otu. He is Director of Labor Research and the Policy Institute. He joins the conversation as well. Doc, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. What is your initial reaction to this entire enterprise, 12 years on, to review the single spine pay policy after 12 years? Of course, we've had the National Labour Conference, and on the back of that, some of these are being deliberated upon. Your quick reaction to the relevance of the timing.
Okay, thank you. If so, I had a review in 2015. But I remember in 2015, the IMF was here. And as the TUC has always been saying, when IMF enters your country, your government doesn't listen to anybody again. So it wasn't possible for us to do that review in 2015. If you look at some of the issues that my co-panelist has just raised about having realistic pay, and you look at the existing pay on the single spine, we wonder whether a 10% inflationary plus adjustment will give us that kind of realistic pay. So if your pay is 800 Ghana cedis and we manage to get you 20%, which is to your pay, and will it be commensurate with all the increases in fuel pricing, transportation and all that? Will it be commensurate? And he also talks about points like consolidating allowances. I mean, to be able to do that, and let me also indicate that allowances have been consolidated, category 1, category up to category 3. 1 and 2 has been consolidated to a large extent. The allowances that actually affect the top issues relating to these conditions of service, a large number of workers in the public sector covered by single spine that are not covered by any form of condition of service. So to be able to do this requires a comprehensive review of the single spine pay policy. But not just that, also a review of pay in the public sector generally, because we also talk about all the inequities in the public sector pay between those on the single spine, and then between those on the single spine, Article 71, the SOEs and other state agencies, where the pay disparities are large and growing.
I'll be right back to you. Let me just conclude with Senor Ajabeng on a few matters because he would have to take leave of us shortly. Mr. Ajabeng, so you have delineated for us or outlined some of the crucial matters and the timing and all of that. But in terms of your expectations, you have said that we should have maybe some such sessions, maybe quarterly and all of that. But as this technical committee goes into reviewing this pay policy, the single spine pay policy, what are the timelines you feel we should be looking at? And I ask this in the context of many such endeavors. So in terms of getting something concrete and enforcing it, what would you say would be your timelines if you were effecting this?
Well, for me, I think 6 months will be adequate. And that means a lot of work day in and day out, sometimes nights, to ensure that this is done. This should be handled as an emergency.
Just to get it clear, 6 months for what? 6 months for the review process or 6 months between review and the start of implementation?
6 months for the review process.
Okay.
Because a lot of consultations have to be done. And with these things, you cannot really rush it. But you can handle it as an emergency and ensure that it goes very fast. I mean, it would be very unrealistic to say that 3 months would be reviewed as well. So under those circumstances, if you give half a year, 6 months, that means before the close of this year, all the work is done, and some of the implementation that can be done without changing the law can then take effect from next budget run, that is from 2023. So I think we have time to be able to do a lot until we see some progress where we can integrate some of these outcomes into the next budget and then implement aspects of it, if possible, in 2023, while we comprehensively review the law and implement the law accordingly.
So if we're using some 6 months, we're in March now. If we're using some 6 months, August, September?
Yes.
And then what would be the timeline? You say in 2023, first quarter, maybe to start implementation of those, decisions that are made?
Yes. So certainly, I'm sure that some of the outcomes may be technical and may not really bother on changing the law before it's implemented. And so those can then be integrated into the budget and it will be implemented from next year while the legal review process goes on from the ministry and so on. And then finally, the reviewed law is passed maybe sometime next year. It is difficult to be able to put a hand on the specifics of the processes for reviewing a law. So it's not easily determined to put timelines on the reviewing of a law and when the law can be passed and implemented. But the technical aspects of the policy that may need review, but not reliant on the change of the law, can be done by the end of the year for implementation from 2023. That timeline, I think, would be, if taken, seriously enough, I think.
I'll allow you to excuse us. So you've made mention of something that I feel is crucial. Can we handle an upward adjustment currently of the single spine payment policy, considering our economic situation? And I don't need to paint that picture to you. You know it better than I do. And also considering our very poor public sector work ethic. Because in the end, the work that is also done must be commensurable with whatever adjustments are made. Do you feel this is a good time? I mean, we've not done it in the past, but is it feasible as of this time?
From information available, pronouncement of the Finance Ministry and other government agencies, even international economic partners, show that it may be quite difficult to do anything about realistic upward adjustments of public sector pay at this time.
Right.
And I don't think that I would be speaking out of context if I say that it is near impossible. But
it is near impossible.
Yes, but under these circumstances, there can still be consultations, and certain areas look that is against the economic conditions that we are facing now, like the high fuel tariffs and so on. So some adjustments can be done, but a realistic increment would be quite that would be possible at this time. As for work ethic, organization, culture, productivity, we put it right at the doorstep of management or of management of an organization. So
right.
for government sector, government would need to put express structures form. And when all these have been done and performance is still inadequate or productivity is still inadequate, there are structures in the law that can have, performance review, and even if terminations and, other sanctions for non-performance, these can be done. But it will not be fair to say productive when we know that evidence-wise they are not well tooled, they are not well resourced. The structures of managing them is also the management of public sector workers, so that we can see some improvement in, like you say, work ethic and then productivity.
Mr. Jabin, thank you so much for your time with us this morning. And we know you're going to be contributing in all of this process. I wish you the best in those enterprises. Have a good day, sir.
Thank you very much. And good morning, Doc.
Dr. Otu, if you can hear me.
Morning.
Good morning.
Right. So Mr. Jabin was just saluting you there. Mr. Jabin, thank you so much for your time. Single spine salary structure and its implementation over the last 12 years that you feel as this technical review committee is going to be, looking at this till the end of the month of March. What are some of the things that you feel they really ought to be focusing on?
Okay. So, I've mentioned one already.
Right.
A pay review such as the single spine pay policy ought to be reviewed occasionally as we go along, given that things keep changing. So, for example, things about market premium relating to scarce skills in the public sector. Given the changing context of employment, such skills will be evolving with constant review, occasional review of the policy. The second thing, a major failure, is the fact that, the single spine had a technical component and administrative component. Unfortunately for us, we've used administrative means to solve technical problems over many years, over the past 12 years of its implementation. So within the industrial relations space, the groups that make the most noise, then administratively we call them and give them something as their placement on the single spine. So we need to be going forward. The review process must be clear on things that you can solve administratively and those that you have to resort to technical analysis to be able to resolve. The other point is about and Mr. Jamin mentioned it, the laws within the public sector. So we want to harmonize pay. We want to reduce inequities. We want to place everybody on the same spine to be able to reduce the inequities. But you have multiple laws and legal regime within the public sector that determine pay. So you put people on the single spine and they tell you that from the Constitution of the Republic, it is my board that is supposed to determine my pay and not the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission. You put people there, or you want to put people there and they tell you that my enabling legislation, the Act of Parliament, says that it is the office of the president that must determine my pay. So one thing that ought to happen if you really want to harmonize pay is to ensure that we first harmonize the laws and the legal regime relating to pay and conditions of service within the public sector. We need to take a very serious view of those laws if you really must avoid the challenges that have attended the single spine pay policy.
So as you talk about this harmonization of the law and regulations, apropos of this discussion that we're having, but that is also going to take quite a bit of time, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the TUC and what it has been saying in terms of the need for a review, and if you look at the fact that, like all of you are saying, we should have been reviewing this in a 5-year cycle, and it's now 12 years, and we're having our very first review, then you would see that, I mean, time is of the essence, but at the same time, you talk about all these harmonizations and legal elements. Is that not just going to mean that this could end up like another, one of our commissions or committees?
I mean, it's a bit risky given the timing in which we find ourselves. We normally say when in fact time to do the things the way you ought to be done. Hello?
Doc, I can hear you. I can hear you. If you could just go back to the point you were making, because yes, I can hear you, Doc. Can you hear me?
Hello?
All right, so we're going to do this. It appears so that when he can hear me, then we continue with the conversation. Of course, we're talking about the single spine salary structure, from the single spine payment policy, whose implementation started just about, or the implementation of which started just about some 12 years ago in 2010. And for the first time, we're having a review on the back of that National Labour Conference. Doc, welcome back. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Great. So if you could just go back to the whole point you were making to that point on harmonizing the laws and regulations, I'd be very grateful.
Okay. So the point I'm making is that, yes, we need time to be able to do some of these things properly and in a manner that will stand the test of time.
Right.
Unfortunately, when we say the times in which we find ourselves, what time is it? It's a time when government is hard-pressed. Government has deficits on its hand. It has high debt on its hand. We recognize that. But this is also a time when workers are also hard-pressed. I mean, in Kwatia, we managed to show the deficit at the micro level for workers, the base pay on the single spine and what it can do or it can do. So the deficit is on both sides, macro level deficit, micro level deficit, and we need to contend with both of them. So there are things we can do initially, sustainability of macroeconomic environment.
Right.
So we need to recognize those things and do them.
What are some of those? Because, I mean, it's going back to the question I posed to Mr. Ajabing a short while ago that, look, how realistic are these? And will it not break the bank? Will it not leave us in the red? Because we're in dire economic straits. So can you outline some of those ones that in the interim, in the short term, or maybe medium term, we can be looking at?
Of course, from a worker's perspective, I mean, part of the effort should be to reduce the deficit at the micro level, to begin to cushion workers. So there ought to be some increases for workers.
Right.
That's why we cannot run away from it. But we also realize that it is not possible to. So we need to come to the table and give and take compromises on both sides. But we need to have our eye on the medium and the long term. The sustainability of the public sector compensation system, both for government but also for workers. We need to have our
right.
And the technical review must ensure that if workers are sacrificing today because government cannot meet squarely all the expectations we have, we ought to be assured that when we sacrifice in the next 2 or 3 years, a policy that is properly reviewed and that is able to give workers pay that is reasonable, that is realistic, that is also equal. Not equal as in same, but that eliminates all the inequities we currently see within the public sector pay compensation system.
Right.
I don't want a situation where, for example, we take a COLA in 2014, 3% in 2015. These are sacrifices by workers. And that is, if you do an analysis, and we have still not recovered from that. So if you must sacrifice, what would be in for us 2 or 3 years down the lane? What will our sacrifices amount to? Will it amount to us having a realistic pay 3 years from now? Is a question we must answer.
And that is a question we must indeed answer. But just answer this for me. When I was interacting with Mr. Ajabing, as part of his proposals or his thoughts, he did mention that we ought to consolidate some of the allowances going to these public sector or public service workers into cash so that we give them cash for them, and in the end, we're also able to subscribe to.
Of course, some allowances have been more or less consolidated. The entire single span actually consolidated category 1 allowance. What we left is category 2 and category 3. That one is also being determined and put in what you call conditions of service for most or for some public sector workers. The challenge is that there's a large number of public sector workers not covered by any collective agreement. If they were to be covered, then you will have those allowances also in their condition of service. And some of them you cannot consolidate. For example, you have acting allowance. So we cannot consolidate that into your pay because we don't know when your boss will leave for you to act. Okay, so it's as and when. I mean, the most serious thing about allowances is the category 4 allowance, where a public officer is entitled to a car, free fuel, a driver, is also entitled to housing. The consultant who worked on the single span actually recommended that either we discontinue with them or we monetize them.
Right.
So, and he's right. He said, I mean, somebody takes 5,000. It's a low pay. He's a director at the ministry, but he also lives in a government bungalow, fully furnished, somewhere at cantonment. His 5,000 is very low, but what would be the price or the rent of that furnished apartment on the open market? It could be something like $3,000, $4,000, but he doesn't count that as part of his pay. So that is why the consultant itself recommended that either we discontinue with these allowances or we monetize them and become part of the pay of those people. And I'm sure that the technical review committee will have to take all of these things in mind. What can we do about these allowances?
Mm. And all of this also brings to mind the likes of UTAG and CITAG and all of them. and even some of the transport unions, the teachers' unions, and what they have been requesting, the COLA you spoke of a short while ago. Do you foresee that this could, in a way, positively affect their situation, even considering UTAG, for example, and its prolonged action, like we've seen in recent times?
I mean, it's difficult, as you have alluded to, in this circumstance, for any worker group to think that we will get realistic pay in 2022. It is difficult. And that is where there ultimately ought to be some sacrifice. But we also recognize that even if it's difficult for government, it is even much more difficult for workers, and something has to be done. Recognizing that we will not be able to achieve all the things that we want to achieve. And I think what ought to happen is that we give ourselves time, 2-3 years, to fix the many problems we have in the public sector pay system. It's difficult to fix all of them because the challenges are huge. The pay level on the single span is absolutely low. It is declining in real terms. And we also see all the inequities between the single span Article 71, between the single span, the state enterprises that are making losses by giving themselves huge salary increases. All of this has to be dealt with. But it cannot be dealt with today. It requires technical analysis. It requires costing them, and it requires giving our time to see what government can do between now and the end of the year, what government can do for 2023, 2024. But all of that must culminate in a situation where workers can feel that there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
There are conditions to improve next year, even if not, we are not getting everything we want this year.
And that bit, that final bit you wrapped with, brought to mind something that in 2019, President of NAGRAT, Angel Kabonu, said at the time, that without reviewing some of these, it just allows government, the employer, to take advantage of some of those in the public service. And again, I'll go back to the bit about whether this is going to have the desired effect. Only time will tell. But tied to that, there has been the suggestion for a national, unemployment insurance scheme in respect of the fact that we have this entire situation where a lot of people as well, even those in the public service from time to time, are let go of, and there is that flux. What do you make of this national unemployment insurance scheme? In other jurisdictions, we have systems to ensure that even those who are unemployed have certain benefits. Here, that is non-existent. What do you make of such a scheme?
I think it's an important initiative that ought to be pursued, and not just for those in the public sector, but even more importantly for those in the mining, private sector, in the maritime industry, in the hotels, where occasionally people lose their job for many reasons, but of course through no fault of theirs. And it's important that when people lose their job, there's something there for them. Because see, what happens is that you've lost your job and you need to look for another one. Sometimes it's even impossible for people to get the transportation to move to another place where there's a job vacancy for them to take advantage of. So a scheme such as this actually pushing workers in such high times as unemployment situations. But it also helps stabilizes the employment situation. There are many times when employers face challenges. They need to let go of workers. There are some employers who feel that it is too disheartening to let go such workers. So they are not able to let them go, and they keep the workers they may not need. So it helps stabilize the labor market, both for employers, but also for workers. And I mean, if you talk about Africa, I think it's only South Africa, Mauritius. Yeah, these are the two countries that I know of that have unemployment insurance scheme. COVID has taught us a lesson that we need to prepare, because we could have such pandemics occasionally. So we need to prepare for it. And we are not the only one trying to do something like this. Kenya has given itself to establish a fully fledged unemployment insurance scheme by the end of 2022. And we should also aim to be able to do that as a way of cushioning workers when they are hit by unemployment situation. And we know these things are with us. People are losing their jobs day in, day out because of pandemics, for technological changes, for unforeseen events that hit their employers. And we need to make sure that such people are supported in the transition to get another job.
Right. Now, in the midst of all of these discussions, we have the tripartite committee that, involving labor, employers, the Ministry for Employment and Labor Relations and all of that. But we also have, interestingly, the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission, which is crucial to this entire enterprise. They have hinted, they had already hinted of this endeavor to review the single spine payment policy. What are you looking forward to as far as the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission is concerned? And I link that to the fact that in the past they've had some, assessments, surveys, and all of that, which haven't amounted to much, because in the end, you need to have your pay packet. You need to have the wherewithal from the employer to be able to even match whatever the surveys reveal. So what are your expectations in this regard?
I think one of the challenges we have noticed around all this pay policy predicament is the weakness of the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission. Weakness in terms
the
of
weakness of the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. As an institution, it is weak and it ought to be strengthened. It ought to be strengthened financially, but also human resource-wise.
Right.
To be able to be on top of the game of administering public sector pay in Ghana. So you have a situation where many workers complain, there's no response, and then they are compelled to embark on strike or some manifestations before they react. If you look at the Fair Wages Law, for example, they are not just to negotiate pay on the single spine. The law says that they are to negotiate pay wherever public funds are being used. So they ought to be able to move to Ghana Ports and Harbours Authority and negotiate on behalf of government, because there it is not consolidated fund, but the money they are using is also public funds. And that is one way by which you can bridge the inequities between the single spine, because they have full knowledge of what they have negotiated on the single spine. And they should bring that knowledge to bear in all the other public sector institutions. Because what we have today is a runaway galloping inequities between those on the single spine and other structures. But for them to be able to do that, they need human resources, experts, competencies, but they also need financial resources to be able to do such a thing.
So for you, to wrap the conversation, Doc, what would be your timelines in terms of a feasible, time belts that we can follow between the survey or, in fact, the work the technical committee will be doing in terms of review, which ones would be adopted, and then implementation? Mr. Jabin gave his. What would be yours to conclude the conversation?
Mine is actually in the communique. The communique says that the technical review committee must be in place by the end of March.
Right.
We are thinking of a review process that is aligned to the next budget cycle. And you know that the next budget will be ready in November.
Right.
So part of what the committee comes up with will have to be reflected in the next budget. Okay. So we are looking roughly at the end of the year, in the next 6-8 months, we need to have some initial reports that can feed into the next budget cycle. But we ought to be mindful that such critical things are not done in an emergency fashion. There are aspects of it we can fast track. But the problem with hurrying things up also is that if you don't take care, you get to the situation you just described, that it becomes one of those technical reports that gather dust. We ought to make sure that we are realistic in our views.
Right.
We ought to make sure that we make deeper analysis that can actually impact the lives of people. And we should avoid knee-jerk emergency approach, ambulance service approach to some of these things, because even though the issues are very immediate, workers are suffering immediately, and sometimes it becomes emotional, but salary matters ought not to be solved emotionally. ought not to be solved in an ambulance fashion. We have to have a medium-term, long-term perspective in mind going forward. But also, there are things the next budget must take on board to be able to address immediate concerns.
Doc, I know I said that was the final bit to you, but this just came to mind. Curious thought. Has the single spine salary structure, that payment policy, from where you sit over these last 12 years, has it served its purpose? Has it lived up to expectation? Briefly on that.
I mean, if you look at the broad, when Kojo Maredu first mentioned single spine in 2006, and in Nkwetia, I read the statement he made. If you look at all the problems he cataloged, which single spine was supposed to be solving, some have been solved, but not all of them have been solved. So, for example, it says that we are bringing all workers on under 190, Article 190 of the Constitution,
right,
on a single spine. That has largely been done. And it's also taught about removing inequities in the public sector pay system. To a very large extent, we have failed in doing that because the inequities persist, and to some extent, they are actually growing. Okay. So some has been achieved, but a significant, important component of the single spine have not been achieved.
So on the back of what you're saying now, if you had to score the policy over these last 12 years out of from 1 to 10, how would you score it?
I'll give it 6.
6 out of 10.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwabena Nyako Otu. Thank you so much for your time with us this morning. He is a Director of Labor Research and Policy Institute. He's been sharing his thoughts with us on this all-important matter. But stay with us. We take a break, and when we return, we talk about mind matters. It would also be interesting on the back of the single spine to have your thoughts on how you are surviving, how you're managing matters with the current situation. Do shoot us your messages with the hashtag AM Show. We'll be right back.